This story is one of those you try not to remember. But some things stick with you, especially when they get under your skin and chill you to the bone. It happened when I was just starting out in the police force, in what seemed to be a quiet little town called Asheville, nestled right at the base of the Appalachians. I was young and green back then, filled with determination and confidence, thinking I understood real fear. How wrong I was. Asheville isn't a metropolis, but it's no village either, a place where everyone knows each other, where neighbors bake apple pies and leave them on your doorstep. Surrounding the town, like many towns along the Appalachians, are thick, dark forests that almost seem to swallow the light as evening falls. The work was routine. Small thefts, drunken brawls, and occasionally a suspicious character loitering at the gas station. The people here are mostly good folks, strong, and rooted in the area, with some families living here for generations. I liked it. The steady rhythm of provincial police work, or so I thought. My partner back then was an experienced officer, Sergeant Bill Carson, a local with a long career behind him. He was calm, solid as a rock, never rushed. Bill knew every nook and cranny of Asheville, every path in those woods, and his words were worth listening to. One late evening, we got a call, a standard duty or so it seemed. Dispatch sent us to an address where an elderly woman had reported an intruder in her house. Bill and I responded, saying we'd be there as quickly as possible. On the way, I had this strange feeling like something wasn't right. Break-ins were rare around here, especially in the homes of the elderly. We drove down a narrow road winding between dark trees until we reached the address. The house stood right at the edge of the forest, old but well-kept, clearly cared for. A dim porch light illuminated the front steps where two figures waited. A man and a woman, both elderly, looking visibly shaken. Their faces were pale, as if they'd seen something unimaginable. I cautiously reached for my gun, feeling the tension in the air growing thicker around us. We stepped out of the car and Bill spoke to them first, his voice steady and calm, as if this were an everyday occurrence. "Good evening. What happened?" The man shook his head, struggling to find the words before finally stammering out. "Someone broke into our house. We heard footsteps and saw a silhouette downstairs. Then it went upstairs." "Upstairs?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman, visibly trembling, whispered, "Yes, it seems like he went up there." Bill nodded slightly, tilting his head and telling the couple to step back to a safe distance away from the house. He then turned to me, exhaled a quick breath, and nodded toward the door. "All right, let's go. You ready?" I nodded back, gripping my gun, and we entered slowly. Inside, there was a silence so dense you could almost hear the blood pounding in your ears. Bill led the way, scanning every corner with a tense gaze. In situations like these, you have to stay calm. Move quietly so you don't give yourself away. The first floor seemed normal, dark, but everything was in its place. We moved slowly, illuminating each corner, each dark hallway, as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. Bill motioned to the staircase leading to the second floor. We exchanged a brief look. On calls like these, that glance isn't just a glance, it's a signal. Stay close, move steady, don't rush. Bill took the first step and the floor creaked slightly, loud in the heavy silence. He paused and we both listened, waiting. But the only answer was the oppressive, weighty silence. We continued up, each step controlled, trying not to make a sound. At the top of the stairs, Bill moved forward cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, casting shadows that danced on the walls. I followed, gun ready, covering him every step of the way. In situations like this, it's not just about moving forward, but being prepared for anything. a sudden turn, a movement behind you. We opened each door in turn. The bedroom, empty, though everything seemed in its place. The second room, a study, dark and unused, covered in dust. Finally, we reached the last room at the end of the hallway, the door slightly ajar, as if someone had closed it hastily but not all the way. We froze. Inside, a strange primal instinct took over. We knew someone was in that room. Every bit of intuition we'd honed over the years screamed it. Bill, standing in front of me, shouted out sharply, announcing that it was the police and ordering the person to come out. But the only response was silence. A silence so deep that it felt like even the house held its breath. Getting no reply, we moved slowly toward the door. Suddenly, Bill threw it open, and I stepped in with my weapon drawn. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the corner, among old, forgotten children's toys that looked untouched for years, something was stirring, and that something didn't seem to notice us at all, as though we were mere shadows on the wall. It was rifling through the toys, searching for something important, something only it knew about. The creature was covered in thick, dark fur, matted and wild, making it look even more like a beast. Its body was massive and muscular, and a heavy tail swayed back and forth like an angry dog's. At first glance, you could mistake it for a wild animal, but the shape, the outline, was all wrong. Its shoulders were too human, its limbs too long, resembling arms with huge claws caught in the carpet. I stood next to Bill, my gaze fixed on this monster, trying to figure out what to do next. We exchanged a look, and in each other's eyes, I saw pure, unfiltered terror. Bill grabbed the radio, struggling to keep the fear out of his voice as he called for backup. "We need backup now. We have something here." He didn't finish, and I knew that explaining what we were facing was impossible. We took a cautious step back, trying not to draw the creature's attention. We understood. This was no human. Speaking to it would be pointless. But suddenly, the creature whipped its head around. Its eyes, glowing in the dim light, locked onto us with a look so malevolent and aware that a chill ran down my spine. Thick, sticky drool dripped from its mouth, splattering onto the floor drop by drop. It froze as if deciding what to do next, then slowly rose. Its posture was tense and menacing, as if preparing to lunge. It tilted its head slightly, studying us, sizing us up like a predator does its prey. Unable to withstand its gaze any longer, Bill raised his gun and fired, aiming ahead to warn it off. The gunshot echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, but it only seemed to anger the creature. It let out a low growl, and, in a blur of movement, lunged straight at Bill, dodging the shot at the last second. I opened fire immediately, but the creature moved so fast it was as if it was gliding between the bullets. In a split second, it bolted for the window, smashing through the glass with its massive body and leaping outside from the second floor. The window shattered, and I stood there for a moment watching as it disappeared into the darkness beyond like a ghost. Bill grabbed his radio again, breathless, shouting, "Shots fired! The creature broke through the window and is heading for the woods. We need backup." We rushed to the back door, feeling our blood pounding in our ears, every step thudding heavily in the quiet of the night. When we burst into the backyard, I scanned the area desperately, trying to catch even a shadow flitting at the edge of the darkness. But it was empty, and only the silence overwhelmed us. The grass was trampled where the creature had leapt from the house, but its trail had already gone cold. Not a single sound, not even a rustle, as if it had melted into the night, becoming one with the eerie darkness. The forest loomed just a few steps beyond the backyard, and I knew it had likely vanished there, hidden among the trees as if the night itself had swallowed it. We stood in silence, staring into the darkness, until Bill finally called into the radio, reporting that the creature had escaped. Backup arrived quickly, the flashing lights slicing through the dark street as our team pulled up to the house. When we explained what had happened, I immediately noticed the skepticism in their eyes. No one said a word out loud, but their faces clearly showed, "Really? A monster?" I understood them. It was a tough story to believe, especially if you hadn't stood in that room and seen that thing break through the window and vanish into the night as if it were nothing. We circled around the backyard and pointed out the signs. The trampled grass where it had landed and a line of tracks leading toward the forest. The ground was soft here, but even from that height, a normal animal would have hurt itself or even broken something. Our teammates inspected the tracks and exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. They were beginning to believe. But even so, there wasn't much we could prove at that moment. A shadow of something unknown and sinister had fallen over this case, and rumors spread through town like wildfire. In a place like this, where everyone knows everyone, news travels fast. Some retold it with exaggerations, others added details, and soon enough after that night people could no longer feel safe, and a sense of unease grew in the air. For a few days after the incident, things stayed quiet, and I started to think it was a one-time event. But then reports started coming in. Townsfolk claimed to see something resembling that creature, usually late at night, just on the edge of the woods or in alleyways. We responded to every call, but each time we arrived, there was nothing. No trace, no sound, only the bewildered faces of the locals. Panic was setting in. What were these creatures, and how many were there? More officers were assigned to the case. The search continued, and Bill and I felt as though these creatures were toying with us, slipping into the shadows each time we got close. On the 5th day after the incident, the worst report came in. One of these creatures had taken a child. It had entered the house and taken the child right in front of the mother before she could do anything. We raced to the scene, but the creature had already escaped into the woods by the time we arrived. A search operation was launched. We combed the area but found nothing. It was as if it had never been there. The following night, disaster struck again. Several children disappeared. It happened the same way at night, as if these creatures knew exactly when and where to strike. By this point, panic gripped the streets, and the townsfolk began to suspect that the police had lost control of the situation. Late one evening, we found ourselves at one of the scenes where a child had been taken. We were gathering evidence, questioning people, everyone on edge. It was already past 3 in the morning, but the whole neighborhood was awake. People were out, watching us with worry, whispering about what had happened. Suddenly, a call came through on the radio from dispatch. There was a report of an intruder in a nearby house. Bill and I exchanged a glance. We knew we couldn't waste a second, and we jumped into the car, heading straight for the location of the call. When we pulled up to the house, there wasn't a sign of life, no lights, no one coming to greet us. Just a faint glow from one window, casting an eerie, mysterious aura over the small, quiet house. It stood off the road, surrounded by old trees whose shadows seemed to swallow it whole. We armed ourselves, exchanging a silent look, and approached the door. Bill knocked first, his fist thudding against the wooden surface. We waited for an answer, but only dead silence filled the air. No footsteps, no sounds from inside. Bill called out, "Police, is anyone home?" But silence was our only response. Then I called out louder, "We're coming in!" And giving the door a slight push, I went in first with Bill close behind, flashlight and weapon ready. Inside, the air was stale, as if no one had been there for days. We moved slowly through the rooms, scanning each corner carefully, until I noticed a faint light slipping from beneath the bathroom door. The door was tightly shut, and the light flickered like it came from an old, unstable bulb. I approached the door and tried the handle, locked from the inside. I knocked. "Police! Open up!" From within, there was movement, quiet but tense. The door creaked open just slightly, and behind it stood a young couple with a child. The man and woman looked as though they were barely holding back panic. The man had his arm protectively over his wife's shoulder, while the woman clutched the child tightly, the child's eyes wide with fear. The man looked at us and finally whispered, Something broke in. We think it was that creature. We hid here." I nodded and tried to reassure them. "Stay here. We'll take care of it." Bill and I immediately moved down the hallway toward the child's room, the one room we hadn't yet checked. I entered first, and in the dim light of a night light in the corner, I saw something that sent a cold sweat down my spine. There, beside the crib, was the creature. It was hunched over, massive and covered in coarse, shaggy fur, so that at first it looked like just a shadow or a large dog. But its shape, it had human-like features, long arms with thick fingers ending in enormous claws that gripped the sides of the crib. It was rocking it, as if trying to soothe it, almost in a trance. And I saw that a doll lay in the crib, carefully wrapped like a child. My heart pounded faster. Bill and I exchanged glances, unable to believe what we were seeing, while the creature continued to rock the crib, its long tail swaying slowly, thick, sticky drool dripping from its mouth. This was something beyond human understanding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking into the eyes of a living nightmare. Suddenly, it turned its head, sensing our gaze. Its eyes glowed yellow in the dark, cold and predatory. It let out a low growl and its body tensed, ready to pounce. "Freeze!" Bill shouted, raising his gun. But the creature ignored him. It bolted for the window. We both fired in unison. I saw one of the bullets strike its leg, causing it to stumble briefly. But even injured, it managed to leap to the window and, shattering it, vanished into the night. We rushed to the window, peering into the darkness, and caught sight of the creature's shadow limping toward the edge of the forest. It disappeared into the trees, and the wood swallowed it once more. We ran outside, barely feeling the ground beneath our feet, and immediately chased after it. The creature moved faster than I'd expected, nearly silent with an odd, jerking gait, dragging its injured leg, yet somehow still gliding between the trees. Before us lay the dark, enigmatic forest, and the creature had already disappeared into its depths. We lit our path with flashlights, and thankfully, it left traces. A trail of flattened grass, broken branches, and faint spots of blood. Bill, as always, proved himself a tracking expert. I had no idea where he'd learned these skills, but his experience was invaluable. He led the way, examining each broken branch and faint print in the ground, while I stayed close, periodically reporting our position over the radio. We both knew that losing sight of this creature would endanger more lives. Tension grew inside me with every step. The forest was pitch dark, our flashlights casting only narrow beams of light, and the shadows around us grew more menacing. Now and then, we caught a glimpse of the creature darting ahead, just at the edge of visibility, as though deliberately taunting us, luring us deeper into the woods. Our pursuit continued, and soon we lost track of time. The night grew thicker, and only the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional heavy breath broke the silence. The cold bit through, but we pressed on. I could feel exhaustion creeping in, but I pushed it aside. We couldn't stop until we caught this monster. The radio began to crackle and lose signal more frequently, but Bill managed to update our location whenever he could. By the time the signal finally died out completely, we were deep in the forest, completely cut off from the others, without communication or support. The forest grew denser, the trees crowding together like silent guardians, blocking out even the faintest slivers of moonlight. The tension built with each step. We had been walking all night, and as the first pale rays of dawn began to break through, the forest finally started to thin. But the creature was still ahead, occasionally flickering between the trees like a ghostly shadow, vanishing every time we tried to close in. Our legs ached with fatigue, every step harder than the last, but neither Bill nor I were willing to stop. We pressed on, heading toward the mountains, following the trail almost automatically now, not even thinking about what might await us ahead. We moved through the forest until Bill suddenly stopped, as if he'd stumbled upon something significant. I followed his gaze and saw it too. Among the fallen leaves, lying in a grotesquely unnatural position, was the creature. We raised our weapons immediately, though it was clear it wouldn't move again. We approached cautiously, keeping our eyes fixed on the motionless body. The creature was dead. Its dark, matted fur was still warm, and its paws bore deep wounds. It seemed to have bled out while fleeing from us. Up close, it looked even more horrifying. Massive claws, a wide jaw now attracting flies, eyes half closed as if frozen in a final, hateful glare. Bill and I exchanged a silent glance, each of us knowing we were on the edge of something far more terrifying than a mere animal attack. Bill examined the scene once more and spotted a trail concealed among the trees, leading further toward the mountains. He pointed it out, and we decided to follow. We left markers along the way, bent branches and scattered sticks, hoping any backup could find our path. As we ventured deeper into the woods, each step seemed more ominous. The trail wound through the trees, the silence thick and unsettling. We moved forward, constantly checking our surroundings, when we began to notice that the tracks of these creatures were becoming more frequent, as if many of them had passed through here. Their deep, distinct paw prints, some stained with blood, covered the ground, suggesting that others might have been injured too. Finally, the trail led us to a small clearing. Before us stood a stone structure, a mix between ruins and a primitive temple, built from crude, heavy stones stacked on top of each other. But the most disturbing feature was the spikes on either side, adorned with the skulls of animals and humans. The empty eye sockets of human skulls stared at us, each seeming to hold a silent scream. A chill gripped my heart, but Bill clenched his jaw and moved cautiously toward the dilapidated door. I followed him, feeling a cold sweat trickle down my back. The door, if you could call it that, was made from old planks, held together by rusty nails. I pushed it open and it creaked unnaturally, revealing a dark room inside. The interior was even more disturbing. The walls were draped with old animal hides, and the floor was littered with bones piled haphazardly like trophies. A foul stench of rot and blood filled the air. Strange symbols, painted in red, or something worse, covered the walls. I couldn't make sense of them, but they felt ancient and evil. As we looked around, my gaze fell on several children's toys scattered in a corner. Nearby lay a single small, dusty shoe, clear and distinct, yet haunting. I looked over at Bill, and the look on his face confirmed it. We were on the right path. We quickly surveyed the room, eager to escape the walls steeped in malevolence. Outside, we spotted another trail leading deeper into the mountains. The path was narrow, overgrown with moss, but it looked recently used. We followed it all day, pushing through thick underbrush and climbing steadily higher into the mountains. The forest grew darker around us, and as the sun began to set, a chill filled the air, bringing an eerie quiet. We knew we couldn't turn back. Somewhere ahead were the children, and the urgency grew with each step. At last, we reached a small clearing hidden among the trees. Strange rhythmic sounds echoed softly, blending with the rustle of the forest. We immediately crouched behind some bushes, careful not to reveal ourselves too soon. The sight before us was something straight out of a nightmare. In the center of a massive stone circle, resembling an ancient Stonehenge, stood the children. They were bound together back to back, surrounded by torches that cast a flickering, ominous light over the scene. The towering stones around them loomed like silent sentinels, saturated with an ancient dread. Red symbols, much like those we'd seen in the stone structure, covered the stones. But the most terrifying sight was what was happening around the children. Encircling them in a strange, hypnotic dance were creatures, 10, maybe 12, of the same kind we had tracked through the woods. They moved in a trance, their bodies jerking unnaturally, as if following some primal rhythm only they could understand. Each step was accompanied by a low, guttural growl, intensifying in time with their movements. These weren't human sounds. They were closer to howls, reminiscent of wolves. A few of the creatures stood off to the side, holding jugs filled with some thick, steaming liquid that gave off a foul odor. They drank from the jugs, wiping their mouths with hairy paws, then swayed back and joined the dance, moving faster and more wildly with each step. Their bodies twisted and leaped, and at times it seemed like they barely touched the ground. Bill and I exchanged a look, feeling the crushing weight of horror. We gripped our weapons, preparing for what we knew would be the final confrontation. But suddenly the creatures froze, motionless and silent. One of them, which appeared to be the leader, stepped forward. Its fur was thicker, its face older and scarred. In one paw, it held a large, jagged knife stained with dried blood. It approached one of the children, raising the weapon. We couldn't stand by. Bill gritted his teeth, and in the next instant, we burst from the bushes and opened fire. There was no room for negotiation. These weren't humans, and there was no reasoning with them. Our sole focus was rescuing the children, and there was no other choice. Bullet after bullet tore into the monsters, and they began to fall, letting out low moans and howls. For a moment they seemed vulnerable, as if they were flesh and blood, like any other creature. I saw one creature collapse as a bullet struck its chest, while another fell when a shot tore through its shoulder. Black blood pooled on the ground, and the wild dance turned into chaotic retreat. 6 creatures lay dead, their bodies piling atop each other, but a few managed to slip into the dark of the forest. Meanwhile, 2 of the creatures charged at us, snarling and baring their teeth. They lunged straight at us, and we both raised our guns and fired. The bullets struck them in the chest and head, and they crumpled to the ground, twitching in their death throes before going still. Around us, the children's cries and sobs filled the air, raw with terror. We rushed over to them, cutting the ropes that bound their hands. They were pale, their eyes filled with genuine horror. Bill assured them it was over, that they were safe now. But I knew the sights and sounds of that night would haunt them for a long time. The forest fell silent again, and only the flickering torchlight cast eerie shadows over the fallen bodies scattered across the clearing. We lined the children up, checking each one to make sure they were unharmed and able to walk. As we made our way back along the forest trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting those creatures to lunge out of the darkness once again. We moved quickly but carefully, and every rustle in the trees sent a chill through my heart. Finally, about halfway down the trail, we were met by backup, police officers and rescue workers. I felt an immense weight lift from my shoulders. We handed the children over. Each of them was frightened and exhausted, and as they were led to safety, I finally allowed myself a deep breath. But our job wasn't over. We soon returned to the site where that horrific ritual had taken place. The clearing was now cordoned off, illuminated by bright lights, and specialists were combing through the area. While I was briefing our superiors on what had happened, a surprised shout came from nearby. Bill and I rushed over to see one of the experts standing over the body of one of the creatures, gesturing at something unusual. The specialist carefully cut into the skin of the creature, and what he revealed left us stunned. Beneath the fur and rough mask was a costume. These weren't real monsters. They were people, dressed in costumes meticulously crafted to mimic terrifying animalistic features. At first glance, no one would have guessed it was a disguise. Even the tail was movable, controlled by some primitive mechanism, and the claws were carefully made from a durable material. When they fully removed the costume from one of the bodies, underneath was a man. His skin was covered in tattoos, symbols we'd seen on the walls and stones around us. Every inch of his body was marked with images, symbols, and grotesque designs, as if he had dedicated himself to some dark and twisted cult. We stood there stunned, examining the other creatures, and soon it became clear they were all people, all in these monstrous costumes designed to turn them into predators, creatures that inspired fear with just a glance. They'd created an illusion, merging themselves with these creatures' images. Their movements, their growls, the distorted features, all of it was part of an elaborate, horrifying show. We began to realize that this wasn't just a group of people. It was a cult. A wild, sinister cult that likely worshipped some ancient beast or creature. They probably believed that by donning these costumes and performing these dark rituals, they were merging with it, offering up children as sacrifices to their twisted devotion. Later, we learned that these people had been using some form of drugs, which could explain their behavior and why they seemed impervious to pain. After the incident, rumors spread through town about what we'd discovered. People whispered about a cult in the woods, about monsters who turned out to be human. But those who managed to escape that night were never caught. They vanished without a trace, as if they dissolved into the mountain forests. Who they really were, why they did what they did, and what creature they honored in their rituals remained a mystery, one that people in Asheville spoke of in hushed tones, casting wary glances toward the dark forest beyond the edge of town. The headlights of our SUV cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow strip of road winding between dense forests. I sat in the passenger seat, glancing at Sheriff Tom Wilson, who was intently focused on driving. We were heading to Sam Harrison's farm. Another call, another mystery to solve. The bodies of mutilated animals had been found in the area for several weeks, but tonight, it felt like something had changed. The sheriff was grim, which in itself was a bad sign. "Jake, have you ever been to Harrison's farm?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the road. "A couple of times," I replied, trying not to reveal my anxiety. "Sam's a good man. I can't understand who would want to harm his livestock." Tom nodded. continuing to drive down the winding road. We left behind the cozy homes of Elm Ridge and were now delving into the forest surrounding our small town. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching our every move. Sam's farm was on the very edge of town, where civilization met the wild. We drove a few more miles before the headlights lit up an old wooden sign that read Harrison's Farm. The road became even rougher here, causing the car to shake and vibrate. Tom turned the wheel sharply, and we veered onto a narrow dirt road. As we approached the farm, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The large barn door was wide open, and the moonlight illuminated the field where the cows once grazed. Now it was littered with the torn bodies of animals. Blood glistened on the grass, like a black mirror reflecting the moonlight. "Damn," Tom whispered, staring at the scene. We got out of the car, and I felt the cold night air seep into my bones. The scent of death lingered in the air. Sam came out to meet us, his face pale and tense. "They came again," he said in a hoarse voice. "This is the third night in a row. At first, I only heard strange noises, but last night..." He trailed off, looking at us with despair in his eyes. "Tell us what happened," the sheriff gently urged, trying to calm the man. Sam sighed and began his story. "I went to bed as usual, but in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. The cows were mooing so desperately it seemed like they had seen the devil himself. I headed to the pen where the noise was coming from and saw something or someone tearing my animals apart. And that sound, the tearing flesh and the wheezing, it almost drove me insane. I saw a shadow, big and unnatural. I couldn't make it out clearly, but I fired a shot. It ran away, but I was scared out of my wits." We nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "You did the right thing, Sam," Tom said. "Let's take a look at where this happened." We walked to the barn, trying not to step on the torn bodies. The night was quiet, only the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. But there was something sinister in this silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. On the ground, amidst the manure and dirt, we found tracks. They looked like wolf prints, but were significantly larger. "This isn't an ordinary wolf," I muttered, examining the paw prints. Tom bent down for a closer look. "Yeah, something much bigger." Sam stood nearby, trembling from the cold and fear. "I don't know what it is, but it's dangerous. My wife is afraid to leave the house. Please help me." "We'll figure it out, Sam. I promise," I said, trying to conceal the internal shiver. The sheriff directed his flashlight at the barn, and we moved closer, inspecting the doorways and walls. Blood stains on the ground told their own story. We saw claw marks on the wooden boards, as if someone or something had tried to break in. "Damn, Jake, look at this," Tom whispered, pointing at the deep scratches. "What kind of creature is this?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. We continued the inspection, trying not to miss any details. The beams of our flashlights revealed tufts of fur, drops of blood, and deep paw prints leading to the forest. Each step was difficult. The ground was wet and sticky from blood and recent rain. When we reached the edge of the forest, I noticed a shadow flitting between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was something more. "Hey, stop!" the sheriff shouted, directing his flashlight toward the shadow. The figure froze for a moment, then swiftly disappeared into the depths of the forest. We exchanged glances and rushed after it, trying not to lose sight. The forest surrounded us on all sides, the trees standing like grim sentinels, hiding their secrets. We moved cautiously, trying not to make unnecessary noise, but every step echoed in the night's silence. Branches cracked underfoot, and every sound made us startle. "Do you see anything?" I whispered, peering into the darkness. "No, but it's here somewhere," Tom replied, his voice low and anxious. Suddenly, we saw something run between the trees. Aiming our flashlights, we noticed it was a person, dressed in a long cloak and white gloves. Their face was hidden by a huge animal skull with deer antlers worn as a mask. "Stop! Sheriff's Department!" Tom shouted, but the figure didn't stop. We chased after it, trying to keep up, but the night and the dense forest had their way. The figure was quick and agile, and soon it disappeared into the darkness. We stopped, panting, and looked around, trying to find any trace. "Damn," Tom swore, peering into the darkness. "We lost him." "What was that?" I asked, still not believing my eyes. "I don't know, but it's definitely not a wolf," Tom replied. "Maybe some kind of lunatic." We continued our search, the beams of our flashlights sliding over the trees, illuminating every branch and bush. We listened to the night sounds, trying to catch the faintest rustle, but the forest seemed to hold its breath, hiding our answers in its depths. After a while, it became clear we wouldn't find any traces of the mysterious stranger. "Jake, there's nothing more here," Tom muttered, disappointedly lowering his flashlight. "He's gone." We turned back, returning to Sam Harrison's farm. There, in the moonlit field, we saw the devastation left by the mysterious creature again. We slowly approached the torn animal bodies, trying to find new clues. "Let's inspect this place one more time," I suggested, directing my flashlight at the ground. We examined every corner of the farm, carefully studying the tracks on the ground, the scratches on the barn walls, and the drops of blood scattered everywhere. The flashlights revealed horrific details: tufts of fur, deep wounds on the animal bodies, and those strange, overly large tracks that still puzzled us. "This couldn't have been an ordinary animal," I said, examining one of the tracks. "I agree," Tom replied, frowning. "We're missing something." We retraced our steps over and over, but found nothing new. Sam stood nearby, his face tense, eyes glistening with fear and exhaustion. "We'll do everything we can, Sam," Tom assured him. "But we need more information. If anything else happens, call us right away." Sam nodded, looking at us gratefully. "Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jake." As we returned to the car, I felt exhaustion weigh heavily on me. My mind was filled with questions that had no answers yet. Tom got behind the wheel and we drove back to town. The road home felt longer and gloomier than before. We remained silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't get the image of that person in the cloak with the animal skull on their head out of my mind. Who were they? And what was their connection to these horrible events? When we finally reached town, I felt a sense of relief. The warm light of the street lamps and the familiar outlines of the houses seemed comforting after the grim forest and the sinister farm. "We'll continue the investigation first thing in the morning," Tom said, stopping the car in front of my house. "Yes, Tom. Tomorrow," I replied, getting out of the car. I stood on my doorstep, watching the sheriff drive away. The night was quiet, but I knew that somewhere out there in the darkness lurked something terrible and sinister. I went inside, trying to calm myself and focus on the next day. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my heart. The night had left many questions and few answers. After a quick breakfast, I headed to the station, where my usual deputy sheriff duties awaited me. The day began as usual. Reports, calls, a few minor incidents that needed to be investigated. But the thoughts of the previous night's events wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I looked at the crime scene photos or reread witness statements, the image of that person in the cloak with the skull on their head resurfaced. By noon, I felt the need for a change of scenery when the phone rang. I looked at the display and saw the name of my younger sister, Lily. "Jake, can you come over for lunch?" Her voice sounded cheerful, but I detected a note of worry. "Lily, I have a lot of work," I began, but she interrupted me. "Please, Jake, Dad will be home too, and I miss you." Her words made me pause. My father and I hadn't gotten along for a long time. Our relationship was strained, but Lily was dear to me. "All right, Lily, I'll come," I agreed, sighing. She was thrilled, thanked me, and hung up. Getting into my old pickup truck, I left the station and headed to my father's house. The road led through the entire town, past familiar places and faces. Elm Ridge was a small town, and everyone knew each other here. People greeted me, some stopped to ask about the investigation, but I just nodded politely and continued on my way. My father's mansion, the mayor's house, stood on a hill on the outskirts of Elm Ridge. A majestic house with tall windows and a well-kept garden surrounded by an iron fence. It symbolized power and status. I parked at the massive gates and got out of the truck. Lily met me at the door, her face lighting up with a joyful smile. "Jake, finally you're here!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me. I picked her up and spun her around, feeling the fatigue and anxiety fade away. "Hey, kiddo, how are you?" I asked, setting her back on the ground. "All good. Dad's waiting for us in the kitchen," she said, grabbing my hand and leading me inside the house. When I entered, Dad was already setting the table. His face looked tired, but he tried not to show it. "Have a seat, Jake," he said, smiling. But I saw the same wariness in his eyes as always. I sat down, looking around at the familiar surroundings. I had grown up in this house and it always felt safe. But now, in light of recent events, something had changed. I felt that difficult conversations and possibly more unanswered questions lay ahead. "Did something happen, Lily?" I asked when Dad left to bring the remaining dishes from the kitchen. She looked at me, her eyes full of care and worry. "I just want us to be together, like before," she said quietly. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness. Dad returned with the food, and we started eating in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The tension between us was palpable, but for Lily's sake, I tried to be patient. After Mom died 10 years ago, Dad changed a lot. Our relationship deteriorated, and I understood him less and less. We became almost strangers. A few years ago, he suddenly decided to run for mayor, which seemed strange to me. He had been a scientist before, and I couldn't understand why he suddenly wanted to go into politics. Lunch passed in strained silence. Dad and I exchanged rare phrases, more focused on the food than on conversation. Lily tried to keep the conversation going, but even her attempts couldn't dispel the oppressive atmosphere. After lunch, Lily suggested we go for a walk, and I agreed to get some fresh air. We went out to the backyard, and I noticed something strange. There were fresh dirt tracks at the back entrance, and Dad's shoes, which were standing by the door, were covered in mud. I took note of it, but quickly forgot, caught up in the conversation. We walked through the garden with Lily talking about her school activities while I tried to listen, though my thoughts kept returning to the investigation. The walk was a pleasant distraction, but soon the sheriff called me. "Jake, you need to get to the Jefferson house right away," he said on the phone. "There's been an incident." I said goodbye to my sister, promising to return soon, and headed to my truck. As I got behind the wheel, tension gripped me again. The drive was short, but I went through all the possible scenarios in my head. When I arrived at the house, the sheriff met me with a serious expression on his face. "What happened?" I asked, getting out of the truck. "You'd better see for yourself," he said, nodding towards the house. We walked past the house and into the backyard, where a horrifying scene awaited us. On their knees on the grass were newlyweds, Jessica and Mark. Their faces were twisted with horror and grief. In front of them, on the grass, lay the torn bodies of their dogs. Blood glistened in the sun, and an ominous silence hung in the air. "Damn," I whispered, gritting my teeth in powerless anger. "When did this happen?" "Seems recent," the sheriff replied, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. Tom and I began examining the crime scene. I carefully studied the tracks while Tom searched for any clues that might help us understand what was happening. On the ground were paw prints, large, deep, clearly not those of an ordinary wolf. We followed them, and they led us to the forest. "Look," I pointed to the tracks that led into the forest. "I think we should check where they go." Tom nodded, and we stepped into the dense thicket. Each step was challenging, the ground covered with undergrowth, and branches snapped underfoot. An eerie silence hung around, and every rustle seemed like a harbinger of new danger. We followed the tracks and soon saw something that made us freeze. In the clearing ahead stood a creature resembling a wolf, but much larger and more terrifying. It stood listening, and its eyes gleamed in the twilight of the forest. "That's it," I whispered, feeling the adrenaline surge through me. "Don't make any sudden moves," the sheriff warned, slowly drawing his weapon. But the creature noticed us and bolted. "After it!" I shouted, chasing after it. We ran through the forest, trying not to lose sight of this horrific being. It moved quickly and deftly, leaping over fallen trees and bushes. Branches whipped at my face, but I ignored the pain, focused only on the pursuit. At some point, I lost sight of it, but then noticed movement ahead again. Tom was moving parallel, trying to corner the creature. "This way!" I shouted when I saw it turn left. We continued the chase, trying to trap it. But the creature was smart. It suddenly stopped, turned around, and charged at us. I fell, feeling it push me. Tom fired a shot, and the beast howled in pain, retreating. "Are you all right?" Tom asked, running over to me. "Yeah, but we need to catch it," I replied, getting to my feet. We resumed the chase, but the creature vanished into the night. "Damn it!" Tom cursed. "It got away!" We stood in the clearing, trying to catch our breath after the intense pursuit. Adrenaline was still pumping through our veins, and I tried to comprehend what kind of beast we had just encountered. We relaxed, thinking it had fled, and for a moment, we let our guard down. But suddenly, the creature burst out from behind the trees and leaped at us. Its eyes glowed with fury, and its bared fangs gleamed menacingly in the moonlight. "Watch out!" I yelled, but it was too late. The creature lunged at us with incredible speed. I managed to draw my gun and fire, but the beast still pounced on me, knocking me to the ground. I felt its sharp claws cut through my arm and screamed in pain. At that moment, Tom fired again, and the beast howled, retreating. The sheriff didn't waste time and continued shooting until the creature collapsed to the ground. I stood up, clutching my bleeding arm, and approached the beast's body. It was breathing heavily, its eyes filled with hatred and fear. We stood over it, and then something strange began to happen. The creature's body started to shake and distort. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, unable to believe his eyes. Before us, something unimaginable occurred. The beast began to transform. Claws and fangs disappeared, fur retracted back into the skin, and gradually a human figure emerged. Within moments, a bleeding man lay on the ground. I could barely believe my eyes. Lying before us was Jonathan Miller, a local farmer who had gone missing a few weeks ago. His eyes were half closed, his face contorted in pain. "Jonathan," I breathed, feeling a wave of shock wash over me. "How is this possible?" Tom stood beside me, his face pale, muttering something under his breath. "What the hell is this?" Jonathan tried to say something, but only a wheeze came out. He looked at us pleadingly, as if trying to explain something, but strength left him. I knelt beside him, trying to keep him conscious. "Jonathan, what happened?" I asked, feeling fear and confusion grip my heart. He just shook his head, his eyes beginning to dim. "Sorry, I didn't mean to," he whispered, and life left his body. We stood in the forest, stunned and bewildered. Before us lay a man who had been turned into a monster. I couldn't understand how this had happened or why. All I knew was that we were facing something far more terrifying than we could have imagined. I knelt and examined him. I noticed strange scars on his body and marks from injections that looked like the result of medical procedures. They were unnaturally precise, as if done in sterile conditions which didn't fit with his current state at all. "Damn it, Tom, look at this," I said, pointing at the scars. "What's going on here?" He nodded, his face pale and tense. He immediately took out his phone and called the local coroner, arranging for the body to be transported to the morgue for an autopsy. While we waited, I couldn't take my eyes off the body. Tom and I exchanged glances, understanding that this wasn't an ordinary murder. Soon the morgue vehicle arrived, and we helped load the body, trying not to pay attention to the driver's grim look. Back at the station, we filed a report on the incident. The superiors listened with skepticism, but when we presented photos and records, their doubts turned to concern. However, we decided not to disclose the information to avoid causing panic in the town. "Let people remain unaware until we figure this out," said the chief, wiping sweat from his forehead. In the evening, sitting in the office, Tom and I tried to connect the attacks to Jonathan's disappearance. "All these cases," I began, rubbing my temples, "seem connected. But how?" Tom thoughtfully looked at the map of the town, dotted with pins marking the attack locations. "Is there anything common between these cases? People, places, times?" As we sat, lost in thought and discussion, the phone suddenly rang. Tom picked it up, and his expression instantly tensed as he listened. I noticed how his face changed. "We're on our way," he said, and hung up, turning to me. "Jake, we've got a new call. A man reported something happening to his wife. The address is 47 Willow Street." We hurried to the car and drove off. Night had already fallen over Elm Ridge, and the town was shrouded in thick darkness. The road felt endlessly long, even though the house was only a few miles from the station. My mind was racing with thoughts of what might await us. When we arrived at the address, I saw a small house standing in the shadow of trees. The windows were dark, and the whole house looked ominous and abandoned. We got out of the car, lighting our way with flashlights, and headed to the front door. It was slightly ajar, and a deathly silence emanated from inside. We entered, moving cautiously down the hallway. Our flashlight beams picked out old furniture and dusty shelves from the darkness. It seemed like no one had lived here for a long time, which didn't match the man's report. "Where are they?" Tom whispered. looking around. Suddenly, we heard a rustling in the next room. I signaled to Tom and we slowly approached the door. My heart was pounding and I struggled to stay calm. We entered and were met with a horrifying scene. 2 werewolves stood in the middle of the room, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight streaming through a broken window. They snarled, baring their sharp fangs, and it looked like they were about to pounce on us. "Tom, watch out!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. The fight began instantly. One of the werewolves charged at Tom, knocking him to the ground. The other lunged at me, and I barely managed to shoot, wounding it in the shoulder. The beast howled in pain but didn't retreat. I fired again, trying to keep them at bay. Tom, pinned under one of the creatures, struggled to break free. I rushed over and fired, making the beast back off. The other werewolf, seeing their chances diminishing, howled in rage and tried to escape the room. "Don't let them get away," Tom shouted, getting up from the floor. I chased after them, but the werewolves were too fast. They jumped through the window and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the scent of blood and fear. We stood there, breathing heavily, looking around. The house fell silent again, but this time it was filled with the realization that the danger was still close. But then, I noticed movement at the edge of the forest through the window. In the moonlight, I saw the silhouette of a person in a cloak with a deer skull on their head. "Look, Tom! It's him!" I shouted, pointing at the figure. The person, as if sensing our attention, turned their head towards us. Their eyes glinted in the darkness and they fled into the forest. "After him!" Tom barked, and we sprinted in pursuit. We ran out of the house and across the field, leaping over tall grass and bumps, trying not to fall behind. We burst into the forest, branches whipping our faces and arms, but we kept running. The person with the deer skull on their head flitted between the trees, sometimes disappearing from view and then reappearing ahead. "Don't fall behind, Jake!" Tom shouted, his voice tense. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't afford to stop. We followed him, trying not to lose sight. The forest around us seemed alive, sounds growing louder, and every shadowy movement reminded us of the unknown evil's presence. The person with the skull emerged from the darkness again, and I saw him turn left into a denser part of the forest. We sharply changed direction, and I began to feel the path becoming more winding and challenging. "Tom, he's leading us somewhere!" I shouted, realizing this wasn't just an escape. "Keep running," he replied. "We need to find out what he's hiding." We kept chasing him until we reached a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The figure stood in the middle of the clearing, silhouetted clearly in the moonlight. He raised his hand as if beckoning us to stop. "What do you want?" Tom yelled, aiming his gun at him. The figure didn't respond, but gestured for us to follow. He turned slowly and began moving towards a shadowy entrance, either a cave or an abandoned building. "What the hell?" I muttered, but I couldn't resist the curiosity and determination. Tom and I, weapons ready, followed him, feeling the darkness of the forest closing in around us. The figure with the deer skull led us deeper into the unknown, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this place held many secrets and dangers. Finally, we approached an old abandoned building, partially overgrown with moss and vines. The figure stopped at the door and gestured for us to enter. "Be ready," Tom whispered. The stranger entered the building first, his silhouette blending into the dim light. We cautiously followed him, but as soon as we stepped inside, he vanished as if he had melted into the air. "Where did he go?" I whispered, peering into the darkness. "I don't know, but stay alert," Tom replied. keeping his gun ready. We started exploring the building, which turned out to be an old, abandoned laboratory. The walls were covered in cobwebs, the floors littered with debris and old equipment. The air smelled of damp and decay. The laboratory tables were cluttered with dusty flasks and test tubes, as if no one had been here for a long time. Suddenly I noticed strange tracks on the floor, as if something had been dragged. They looked fresh, as if someone had recently left them here. We followed them, and they led us to the back of the laboratory. There, we found a door. It was slightly ajar, and light was coming from inside, which seemed odd considering how abandoned the laboratory looked. "I think we should check this out," Tom said, cautiously pushing the door open wider. We entered and found ourselves in another, more modern laboratory. Everything here looked as if it had been recently used. The floors were clean, the equipment looked newer, and the lighting was dim but functional. The laboratory tables were lined with modern instruments, computers, and chemical reagents. Diagrams and charts hung on the walls, most of which concerned genetic research and experiments. "Damn, Jake," Tom whispered, looking around. "Someone is definitely continuing experiments here." I approached one of the tables and noticed records written in neat handwriting. They detailed DNA modifications and transformations. Horrible suspicions began to form in my mind. "Tom, look at this," I said, handing him the records. "This is all related to what happened to Jonathan and the others." We continued to explore the laboratory, finding more evidence that dangerous experiments had been conducted here. In one corner, I found a cabinet with medications and strange vials filled with liquids of various colors. "This place is a nightmare," Tom muttered. "But who is behind this?" As we continued to investigate the premises, Tom pointed to a massive steel cabinet standing against the far wall. Its doors were locked but looked old enough to be forced open. We exchanged glances, understanding that the cabinet might hold answers to our questions. "Let's try to open it," Tom suggested, and I nodded, grabbing the handle. With some effort, we finally managed to open the cabinet doors with a prolonged creak. Behind them, we discovered a hidden door that we hadn't noticed initially. The door was open. "Damn, what do you think is behind this door?" I whispered, feeling my heart race. The sheriff shrugged. We stepped into the dimly lit corridor, which led us deeper into the building. It was cleaner here, the air fresher, and the feeling of neglect was replaced by a sense of secret activity. At the end of the corridor, we came across a massive door with a porthole. Inside, there was muted light, and through the glass we could see a large room. We exchanged glances, realizing that something important might be hidden inside. "Ready?" Tom asked, and I nodded, summoning all my courage. We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a large hall filled with various equipment. In the center of the hall stood a giant glass capsule filled with murky liquid. Through its walls, we could see a vague outline of a creature slowly moving inside the liquid. "What the hell is this?" Tom whispered, moving closer. I shone my flashlight on the capsule, and the creature inside became clearer. It resembled a wolf, huge with long claws and terrifying fangs. Its eyes were closed, and it seemed to be in a state of sleep or deep trance. We stood in horror, unable to believe our eyes. "How is this possible?" I muttered, feeling fear grip me. At the bottom of the capsule was a plaque. I leaned in to read the inscription, and my heart stopped. Engraved on the plaque was my mother's name. "No, this can't be," I whispered, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. "Jake, what does it say?" Tom asked, but I couldn't respond, still processing what I had seen. He looked at the plaque and his face turned pale. Your mother? Was she a victim of these experiments? I nodded, unable to speak. We turned our attention to a table next to the capsule, filled with notes and journals. I quickly grabbed one of the journals and began flipping through the pages. The entries were neatly written with diagrams and detailed descriptions of experiments. Genetic modification experiments. DNA transformations. I read aloud, feeling horror tighten around my heart. They used people as test subjects. The sheriff carefully studied the records, his face growing darker with each page he read. Your mother, she was one of the first. They altered her DNA trying to create something new. We continued reading, delving into the nightmarish details of the experiments. Horrible procedures, injections of unknown substances, transformations that turned people into monsters. This is madness, Tom muttered, throwing the records onto the table. What kind of person could do something like this? I stood, clutching the journal, feeling a wave of anger and despair wash over me. These people had ruined my mother's life, turning her into a monster. And now these experiments were continuing, spreading chaos and death in our town. I hadn't yet processed everything I had seen when Tom called me over. He had noticed another door in the far wall, less obvious, hidden behind shelves of scientific equipment. There might be more behind this, Tom murmured, heading for the door. We approached and struggled to move the shelves, clearing the way. The door was locked. Tom quickly dealt with the lock, and we cautiously stepped inside. We found ourselves in a narrow corridor, lit by dim, flickering lamps. We walked forward slowly, feeling the walls close in around us. With each step, the tension grew, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were approaching something important. This corridor is too long, I whispered, looking around. I agree, Tom replied, his voice echoing around us. Finally, we reached the end of the corridor and stood before a massive door, much more modern and secure than the others. Tom carefully opened it, and we stepped into a spacious room. At first glance, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Looking around, I realized this was my father's office. The setting was painfully familiar. An old desk with neatly arranged papers, bookshelves filled with scientific works, and a large leather chair. This can't be, I whispered, feeling my head spin. How could his office be here? Are you sure? Tom asked, also examining the room. Maybe it's just a coincidence? No, Tom, I replied, approaching the desk and picking up one of the photographs. It was of me, my sister Lily, and my father, taken many years ago. This is definitely his office, but how is he connected to all this? Suddenly it hit me. My father was a scientist, I began, piecing the puzzle together in my mind, but I never thought he could be involved in something like this. Tom listened carefully, then suggested, we should search the house. Maybe we'll find some clues. We began searching the room, turning over every book, examining every document. But despite our efforts, we found nothing concrete about his involvement in the experiments. The only thing clear was that the office had been left in a hurry. Where could he be? The sheriff muttered when we finished searching. And where is Lily? I added. We exchanged glances, realizing the seriousness of the situation. We need to get back to the lab, I said. Maybe we'll find more answers there. When we returned, the first thing we noticed was movement in the corner of the room. The beams of our flashlights illuminated the figure in a cloak and deer skull mask.
"Hey, stop!"
Tom shouted, aiming his gun at the figure. I followed his lead, feeling my heart race. The person froze, raising their hands as if surrendering. We slowly approached, weapons ready. Tom yanked the skull off his head, and we both froze in horror. Standing before us was a man whose face was scarred and disfigured. It looked like something between human and wolf. His eyes were filled with pain and desperation. His skin covered in scars and marks from failed surgeries. He looked like a living testament to a failed experiment. "What happened to you?" Tom asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Did my father do this?" I added, feeling horror and rage mix within me. The man slowly lowered his hands and spoke in a raspy voice. "Yes, your father. He kidnapped me years ago. I was an ordinary farmer, but he chose me for his experiments. He wanted to create the perfect being by combining human and wolf DNA. But something went wrong. I was left like this. A freak." We exchanged glances with Tom, realizing the horrible truth. The man continued his story, his voice trembling with pain and anger. "I tried to escape, and I did. But I knew I couldn't just return to normal life. My face, I became an outcast. I hid in the woods, trying to survive. And all this time I thought of only one thing: revenge on your father. He ruined my life, turned me into a monster." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Tom asked, his voice filled with compassion. "Your father is the mayor," the man replied bitterly. "He has connections. He did everything to hide his experiments. And who would believe a freak claiming the town's mayor is a mad scientist? I tried to warn others, but people were afraid of me and no one listened. The only thing I could do was scare people and try to draw attention to what was happening." We stood, stunned by his story. I felt a wave of rage wash over me. My father, a man I trusted, had turned out to be a monster capable of such horrors. The man suddenly looked at his watch, and his eyes widened in alarm. "Morning is approaching," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Today your father has gathered all the townspeople for an important announcement. He's planning something, I know it. We must act immediately." We realized that time was running out. "We need to go," I told Tom, and he nodded. We quickly led the man out of the lab and headed for the exit. As we moved through the corridor, we kept him between us to ensure he wouldn't escape. When we emerged from the building, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, illuminating the grim forest. "Quick to the car," Tom ordered, and we hurried to our SUV. The man sat in the back seat, and Tom and I took our places in the front. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the winding road leading to the town center. My mind was racing with thoughts, but I knew one thing. We had to stop whatever my father had planned. "What could he be announcing?" I asked, turning to our captive. "I'm not sure," he replied, his voice shaking. "But he's always planning something. Maybe he's going to make another statement about the town's safety or his new initiatives, but I'm sure there's more behind it." We sped down the road, and with each mile, the feeling of anxiety grew stronger. Soon we reached the town center. People were already gathering in the square, many looking sleepy but curious. A stage was set up, and my father, dressed in his official suit, was preparing to speak. "We need to act quickly," Tom said, getting out of the car. "We can't let him talk." We hurried toward the stage, drawing the eyes of the townspeople. Some recognized us, and I saw confusion and concern in their eyes. We led our captive with us, his face hidden by a hood. "Tom, Jake, what's going on?" one of our colleagues asked, approaching us. "We need backup," Tom replied. "We have to arrest the mayor. Right now." Our colleague looked at us, then at the stage, and his eyes widened in understanding. "Got it. I'll inform the others." We continued toward the stage, and I saw my father preparing to start his speech. The crowd was silent, waiting. I felt adrenaline surge through me and quickened my pace. "Father," I shouted, stepping onto the stage, "you need to stop this right now." He turned to me, his face showing surprise and irritation. "Jake, what are you doing? This is an important announcement for the town." "No, you need to stop," I said, my hand resting on my pistol. "We know all about your experiments. Your crimes will be exposed." The crowd began to murmur, people looking at us with confusion and fear. My father glanced quickly at the disfigured man we had brought with us, and his face paled. "What have you done, Father?" I asked, feeling anger and disappointment merge into one. "This man is your victim." My father tried to compose himself and said, looking at the crowd, "It's all lies. This man is a criminal and they are trying to slander me." "No," Tom said firmly, stepping onto the stage. "We have evidence. We know all about your experiments, and we won't let you continue." At that moment, our colleagues arrived at the stage, surrounding it, and began to arrest my father. The people in the crowd were shocked and didn't understand what was happening. My father, desperately resisting arrest, screamed, "It was to save your mother." I stopped, stunned, and looked at him. "What did you say?" Realizing he had nothing left to lose, my father spoke, his voice filled with bitterness and despair. "She was in a terrible accident. She was dying, and I couldn't let that happen. I loved her more than anything. I used my old research, my experiments to save her. I couldn't let her die." I was dumbfounded. Everything he had done, all the evil he had committed, was to save my mother. But why didn't he stop? Why didn't he find another way? "You turned her into a monster," I said, feeling the anger surge again. "And you continued your experiments, ruining others' lives." "I tried to save her!" he yelled, tears streaming down his face. "But everything went wrong. She was the one I loved. I tried to fix my mistakes, but it only made things worse. I couldn't stop." Suddenly, screams erupted, and we turned. Several werewolves had burst into the square, their eyes glowing with fury, their fangs bared in a terrifying snarl. But instead of attacking, they surrounded the crowd, emitting ominous, prolonged howls. "They're here!" Tom shouted, drawing his pistol. The crowd plunged into chaos and panic. People screamed, trying to flee, but the werewolves didn't attack. They just stood around, continuing to howl as if obeying some sinister command. "What are they doing?" I whispered, feeling my heart pound in my chest. "I don't know, but it's strange," Tom replied, his pistol at the ready. "They're not attacking, just surrounding us." At that moment, my father, standing on the stage, yelled, "It's too late! I couldn't save your mother, but I accidentally infected all the townspeople." His words struck like a thunderbolt. "What did you say?" I exclaimed, not believing my ears. "I tried to find a way to cure her, but the experiment got out of control," he cried, his face twisted in agony. "I accidentally released a virus, and it infected everyone in the town. Any of you could become like them." Suddenly, my father began to tremble, his face contorted with pain. His body started to change right before our eyes. His skin began to sprout thick fur. Bones cracked and shifted, transforming him into something horrific. "What's happening to him?" I screamed, feeling horror wash over me. But he wasn't the only one. People in the square also started to transform. They screamed as their bodies twisted and deformed, turning into half-wolf monstrosities. The crowd panicked. People tried to run, but they couldn't escape the changes happening in their bodies. "I don't know what to do," Tom shouted, his voice filled with fear and despair. "We need to run." But before we could do anything, Tom himself began to transform. His face contorted with pain. His body grew, covered in thick fur. He collapsed to his knees, then to the ground, emitting guttural sounds. "Tom!" I shouted, but it was too late. He had turned into a beast. Realizing I was alone, I started to run, but soon felt the changes happening in my own body. A burning sensation shot through my spine. My muscles began to contract uncontrollably. I stumbled and fell to the ground, feeling my hands and feet starting to change. My skin became rough and covered with fur. Bones cracked, lengthening and changing shape. I felt my face elongate, fangs growing. The pain was unbearable, and I emitted inhuman sounds. Every cell in my body screamed in pain, and I realized I could no longer control my movements. My last clear thought was, "I'm no longer human." As I transformed, I saw the man with the skull smirking at me, watching the chaos unfold.